Ambassador Yoren, good morning. Are you able to hear us?
I can hear you.
Awesome. Well, we're happy to welcome you here to Gulliver Preparatory. So let's welcome you. So all the classes that are involved in the international diplomacy program here at Gulliver, and Ivan Pankov, who I'm sure you're familiar with, has been able to put this together for all of us today. So we're all looking forward to your remarks and then to the question and answers that our students, the session that they've prepared. So I'm going to hand it over to Ivan, and with that we'll begin. So thank you for taking the time today.
Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. On behalf of Gulliver's International Diplomacy and Legal Studies Department and the High School Foreign Service Association, we would like to welcome you all to today's event. In cooperation with the American Foreign Service Association, we have had the chance to invite a renowned diplomat to speak on the topic of the present and future of NATO. We are fortunate to have the privilege and honor to welcome Ambassador Hugo Lorenz. Ambassador Lorenz graduated from Georgetown University in 1977 with a bachelor's degree in science and foreign service, and from the University of Kent in the United Kingdom in 1980 with a master's of arts in economics. He started his work in 1981, the first year of the Reagan administration, and since then and until 2017, he served 10 presidential administrations on both sides of the political spectrum, remaining an indispensable official to his country, regardless of the political beliefs of those in power. Ambassador Lorenz has more than 30 years of diplomatic experience, with deployments on 6 continents. He served in Australia, Argentina, Canada, and Spain. He was the Director of Andean Affairs at the National Security Council, and he was the National Security Advisor to President Bush. In 2008 and until 2011, he served as the U.S. Ambassador to Honduras, helping create the Tegucigalpa-San Jose, which solved the nation's constitutional crisis and brought stability to the country. Between 2012 and 2013, he worked in an ambassador-level position in Kabul, Afghanistan, where he played a prominent role in the creation of the bilateral security agreement, which stabilized the country and relieved American troops of active combat units. He returned to Afghanistan in 2016 and took charge of the U.S. Embassy in Kabul. There, he led the largest embassy in the world with over 8,500 U.S. foreign nationals representing 22 U.S. agencies. He managed ties with the Afghan government and worked closely with NATO officials to bring peace and stability to the country during the transition between the Obama and Trump administrations. We are incredibly grateful that Ambassador Lorenz has come to speak to us and share his experience and knowledge. So let's all welcome him.
Well, very good. Ivan, thanks very much for organizing this event. I really want to commend you. You worked very hard and you made it easy for me. We worked out the final kinks on the, on the technology piece. I'm a 19th century man, so, but Ivan got me straight. And again, I really also commend you for your efforts to promote the Foreign Service and international relations. And I do hope, I think we've got a good audience today, and I think it's important. I mean, if you want, maybe we can talk also a little bit about a Foreign Service career. Ivan talked a little bit about my career, but I wanted to tell you I spent 36 years, as Ivan said, in the U.S. Foreign Service, started in 1981 and ended my career at the end of 2017 when I was leading our embassy in Kabul, Afghanistan. But what I wanted to tell you is I loved my career. I loved every minute of it. It's an exciting profession. But from a lifestyle perspective, if you're someone who likes to travel, you like to meet a lot of very interesting people. If you like change, because every 2 or 3 years you move on, you go to a different country, a completely different culture. You learn if you're interested in learning languages, but also if you're interested in serving your country, if you can identify with service to the United States. It's a wonderful career. I have my wife who spent nearly all of my career with me and my 2 sons. So my 2 boys, Andrew and Dirk, traveled around with us by the time they went off to college, okay? Andrew had lived in 8 countries and Dirk in 9 when he went off to school. So for them, it's challenging, okay? It's not easy getting pulled away from your friends every couple of years and going to a completely different school. It's very much like the military. But again, their awareness of the world, the experiences that they've had were amazing. So if you think down the line, if you have an international career and you have a family, you would give, I think, your kids a very privileged life, a very interesting life. And although my kids, again, it was challenging, all the moves. If you talk to them today, now they're grown up, they're in their early 30s, they're young professionals, they would say that it was all worth it. So I wanted just to mention that. If anyone has a question at the end of my presentation on NATO about the Foreign Service, I will try to answer it, okay? Look, we're appreciate your interest in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It's obviously very relevant right now with everything going on in the Ukraine. But what I would say is that NATO is arguably the most successful military alliance in history. It's been around for more than 70 years. It is composed of members, all of them democracies, who voluntarily chose to join this alliance. So there are no satellite nations, people who've been coerced into being part of NATO. Every nation that has joined from the very beginning, from its inception back in 1948, made the decision to be part of NATO because these are countries that share common values, particularly democracy, freedom, but also believe that sticking together is good for each country's collective individual security, and it's good for the collective security. NATO was created at the end of World War II. And for any of you who've read and know a little bit about World War II, I mean, that was a catastrophic event for humanity, but it was a good cause. The Allies at that time were the United States, England, the British Empire, the French, who had been defeated by the Nazis, but still, they had a government in exile and played a role. And then, of course, the Soviet Union, Russia, the communist, the socialist country, and we united because of the common threat of Hitler. Hitler's attempt to conquer all of Europe and all of the horrible crimes that he committed. So we did not like the Soviet Union. We did not like Stalin, who was a ruthless leader who led the Soviet Union. But we did it because we needed to defeat the Nazis and Mussolini in Italy, and also eventually, our fight against the militarism in Japan. But when the war ended and the war was over, essentially, American and British and French forces had taken most of what is today, Western Europe. And the Soviets, who had come from the East and defeated the Nazi armies in the East, had come in from Eastern Europe, from the Russian-Soviet border, and come down and taken and occupied as liberators initially, liberating these people from Nazi rule. But their armies were in Poland, in Hungary and Czechoslovakia and Bulgaria. And when they occupied it, very soon after the war ended back in 1945, it was clear that the Soviets had no intention of leaving these countries. That they occupied them, and they had no interest in having these countries be able to have their own freedom and self-determination. That they imposed on them a communist, Polish communist, Hungarian communist, and instituted dictatorships in all of these countries. And they maintained their military occupation. So very soon after World War II, tensions began between the United States and its Western allies and the Soviet Union, and their attempt to expand and subjugate the countries of Eastern Europe. The Soviet Union and its Marxist agents were also trying to destabilize the countries of Western Europe. Again, after the war, the Western Europeans were in a terrible way. The French, the Italians, the Germans, Germany had been destroyed, and they were suffering greatly, great economic hardship. People were going hungry. And in that instability, the Soviets had agents and, again, trying to promote a revolution and overthrow the very fragile governments in Western Europe. So it is in that context of the beginnings of the Cold War that NATO is created, okay? And NATO is created in April 4, 1945, with what's called the signing of the North Atlantic Treaty. Some call it the Washington Treaty, but I think the formal name is the North Atlantic Treaty. And again, the purpose of the creation of this alliance was as a counterweight to the presence of these massive Soviet armies stationed in Central and Eastern Europe. And they are the perception by the countries that joined this alliance that they were under threat. The initial members, there were 12 initial members in the signing of the Atlantic Treaty. And these were Belgium, Canada, Denmark, France, Iceland, Italy, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Norway, Portugal, the United Kingdom, and the United States. And then, of course, the United States was the leader. I mean, we came out from World War II as one of the two preeminent powers in the world and the leader of the free world, okay? Later on, NATO gradually expanded in 1952 to both Greece, a southern European country, and Turkey, which kind of straddles Europe and the Middle East, became a member in 1952. And then in 1955, it was the very controversial entry of West Germany, because after World War II, the Soviet Union and the Western Allies, in essence, Germany wound up partitioned between a Western, pro-US, pro-British, democratic country, and East Germany, which was under Soviet control, and a communist dictatorship was installed in East Germany. So Germany was divided into two. In 1955, West Germany joined NATO and was a critical player, because it was at if you look at a map of Europe, in Central Europe, West Germany was a critical linchpin of the Western Alliance, the NATO alliance, and particularly the city of Berlin, which actually, the city of Berlin was actually inside of East German communist territory. So Berlin was over the period of the Cold War, was always a period of great tension. The communists built a wall that separated the city between the free part of Berlin and the communist part. But it was important for Germany to become a member, okay? The point I would make is that during the Cold War, you had these massive armies. The Soviets maintained their massive, military presence in the East. They created their own pro-Soviet alliance, military alliance called the Warsaw Pact. Although these countries, the people in these countries did not support the Russians and did not support Marxism, but it was forced upon them. And then on the Western side, NATO built up quite a substantial military power. So if you looked at Germany, which was the central front where the armies were literally confronting each other, the US had a massive military presence at that time. We had something in the 50s and into the 60s and 70s. We had as many as 400,000 US troops deployed, mostly in Germany, but we had US NATO bases all over Europe, in Italy, in Greece, in Turkey, in Spain, in the Netherlands, obviously in the United Kingdom, in England. So the US had this vast network of bases on its side. And then it deployed this very large ground army in Germany confronting the Red Army. But we also had our allies who were fully deployed. Everyone was heavily armed at that time. So there was a very large British presence, participation in NATO. France was a very active member, okay? So what would be the point I would make? The point I would make is that although there were actually nuclear weapons deployed on both sides, small nuclear weapons, larger nuclear weapons, so it was a very dangerous situation. If there ever would have been a military clash between the communists and the free world, NATO and the Warsaw Pact, there was a high potential that it could have expanded into a nuclear war. And of course, everyone would have been the loser. But to a significant degree, the US nuclear arsenal served as an insurance that helped protect the Western Europeans and our NATO allies. So a strategic weapon for the protection of Europe was the US nuclear arsenal, okay? What's the bottom line? It was none of you were born during the Cold War, but I grew up. I was born in 1954. The Cold War was a big, huge part of all our lives. I remember living in Florida. I grew up in New York, but at that time I was living in Florida in 1962 during the missile crisis in Cuba, and we actually thought that there would be a nuclear war. And of course, NATO would have been on the front lines of that. Berlin would have been a frontline state if we would have had this potential for this massive conflagration between the US and the Soviet Union, between NATO and the Warsaw Pact. But the good news is that peace was maintained, that NATO, with its substantial military power, was able to deter the Soviets, and the Soviets never launched an attack on the West that would have triggered a war. So when I say NATO is the most successful military alliance in history, is because it succeeded in a very dangerous period in world history of maintaining the peace. As you all know, eventually the Soviets collapsed, communism collapsed. I'm not going to get into that, but the system didn't work. The economies in Russia and Eastern Europe were a mess. Meanwhile, Western Europe had continued to prosper. They became, with US help, the Western Europeans became wealthy again after the World War II destruction. Meanwhile, on the Soviet side, it was a disaster. And eventually, the Soviets themselves realized that it was not a viable system. And under General Secretary Gorbachev in the 1980s, eventually the Soviet Union transitioned to a more open system. And in 1992, the Soviet Union collapsed, okay? And during the 90s, you had a brief period where the Soviet Union returned to the democratic camp. President Yeltsin was elected. He was freely elected. There was a lot of freedom in Russia. There was no longer a Soviet Union. The Soviet Union gave freedom to many countries that were part of the Soviet Union that they had conquered. in Central Asia, in the Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, and then the satellite countries that were part of the Warsaw Pact, Poland, Hungary, Bulgaria, Romania, they were all given their independence, okay? So in the 1990s, relations between the US and the West and Russia were pretty good, and there was good cooperation. And then in the late 1990s, many countries that were part of the Soviet Empire, that were satellites of the Soviet Union, actually voluntarily, they were now democratic nations. They made the choice to become part of NATO. So there was a major expansion of the NATO alliance to the east, okay, in the 90s, after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And that included, again, the Baltic states that border Russia, that include Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Hungary, the new Czech Republic, Slovakia, Slovenia, Bulgaria, Romania, all of these Eastern European states voluntarily with their democratic governments became members of NATO, okay? So it was a very huge expansion. That expansion has continued. I think the last country in the Balkans, some of the Balkan countries became NATO members. The last one was Macedonia. In 2020, I believe there are about 29 members of NATO right now. So it's a huge alliance, covers a huge area. So as we get into the 90s, there was one major NATO deployment that you should all be aware of, and that was there was a crisis with the breakup of Yugoslavia in Southern Europe. It splintered after Tito, the dictator, died, who was sort of a communist dictator. The countries, different nationalities. Yugoslavia is made up of many nationalities. The country broke up, and there was a lot of fighting between Serbia and some of the other states that were created after the collapse of Yugoslavia. And there was a fighting that resulted in genocide that was committed against by Serbians against Bosnians. It was a horrible period. And I would just mention that in the late 90s, President Clinton and NATO used military forces. It was a NATO operation against Serbia to end their repression of the others, Serbians, the Bosnians. So that was one deployment of NATO. Today, there are still NATO peacekeeping forces deployed in the Balkans. So I would mention that. And then the other very significant issue was September 11, as you all, on September 11, as you know, international terrorists, Al-Qaeda, under the leadership of Osama bin Laden, attacked America. We had the destruction of the World Trade Center, the attack on the Pentagon. It was the largest attack ever perpetrated by our enemies in the American homeland. Thousands of people were killed. On the day after the attack, NATO, with its headquarters in Brussels, Belgium, because it's always, from the beginning, NATO has always had its headquarters in Belgium. The NATO members invoked Article 5 of the NATO Charter, of the NATO Treaty. And that article is the most important article that you should be aware of in the NATO alliance, which is that an attack on one country by an outside force is an attack on all. So all of us, all 29 members, are committed that if one of the members gets attacked, the others will join and come to the aid of the country that's been attacked. In the case of September 11, all the other NATO nations, we invoked together Article 5, and all of our NATO allies came with us to Afghanistan. when President Bush ordered the invasion of Afghanistan and we initially defeated the Taliban, with us were all of our NATO allies. British troops, Italian troops, German, Spanish, everyone served with us in Afghanistan. So there's a great example of NATO solidarity. But that was unusual because NATO was mostly conceived as a European alliance. And you looked at the fact that European and North American, because US and Canada are very prominent members of NATO, that the sphere of operations would be in Europe or North America. But the reality was, because of the nature of the September 11 attack, we actually deployed to Afghanistan. As many of you know, that deployment ended with President Biden's decision to withdraw our forces in 2021, last year, the April 14 decision, and our NATO allies withdrew with us. Okay, by the way, they didn't really want to withdraw. Our NATO allies believed we should have stayed in Afghanistan, but that's another story. That will kind of distract us from talking about the NATO. So maybe I've got about 5 minutes because I really want to take time for your questions. But I would say where we are now is the honeymoon days of our relationship with Russia in the 1990s and the beginning of the 2000s gradually ended. Vladimir Putin was elected president of Russia, and then he gradually began to accumulate power. And today he is more or less a dictator. He cracked down on the opposition, probably manipulated elections to make these elections pretty fraudulent, repressed the media, opposition groups. So Putin, as he became this authoritarian leader, there began a lot of tension between Russia and NATO. So as we fast forward to now, the Ukraine is a new flashpoint. Ukraine is not a member of NATO, but it is a country that right now has a democratic government. They have a democratically elected leader, President Zelensky. Ukraine has leaned to the West. They have very close economic relationships with the European Union, with the United States, with Canada. They have interest in becoming members of NATO. NATO has an open door policy that if countries voluntarily want to become members of NATO, they can. Russia's, Putin's, as you know right now, he's been arguing for a very long time that that if the Ukraine, and the Ukraine is on the border with Russia, becomes a member of NATO, they see that as a direct threat to Russia's national security, and that's there. I mean, and that there's an argument to be made by Russia on that score, and so but again, Putin's behavior, and not only vis-a-vis Ukraine, but vis-a-vis other countries in Central Asia, in Georgia, where they took a piece of Georgia, they annexed territory in Georgia, has been very aggressive. Again, it's a resurgence of Russian nationalism, and the Russian army has been rebuilt after the collapse of the Soviet Union. The army collapsed for a while, but it's been rebuilt, and they're reasonably powerful. Russia remains the other great nuclear superpower. In that regard, Russia is still a superpower. It has 7,000 or 8,000 nuclear weapons, which is a comparable number as the United States. So they are, you have to take them very seriously. But now Putin is threatening the Ukraine directly. And so far, NATO countries, the thing I would also mention is, as part of this very aggressive approach by Putin, one of the things he did was in 2014, he seized a part of the Ukraine. he annexed the Crimea. Now, the Crimea is an interesting area. It's part of the Ukraine, but it has a very large, sizable ethnic Russian population. So the reality is that there are many people in the Ukraine, because of their Russian ethnicity, are pro-Russia. But again, the Crimea is a part of the Ukraine. So this was almost the first time since World War II, since Hitler, that one European nation would have attacked another and formally annexed a piece of its territory. But since that annexation, NATO, the United States, and its allies have been providing military assistance to the Ukraine to help to rebuild their military. So right now we're in this situation where Putin is making all sorts of demands on the United States, on NATO. They want a promise that the US and NATO will not incorporate the Ukraine, the open door policy, where if a country wants to become a member, they can join. So far, the US and NATO have resisted this demand by Russia. And again, Russia is also asking the US and NATO to pull back any troops and aircraft that we may have in countries that were part of the old Soviet Union, or countries that were Soviet satellites like Poland, Romania. So it is something, it's a non-starter. It's something that the United States and NATO are not going to agree to. But clearly, Putin is putting demands that he knows are unacceptable to the NATO nations. So you ask, well, why are they doing that? And many people think that he's using it as an excuse to invade the Ukraine. So right now, the Russians have built up a very sizable military force, ground forces, air, naval in the Black Sea, all surrounding the Ukraine. And, the intelligence shows that there's a significant probability of some type of Russian attack against the Ukraine. We'll just have to see. But in many ways, I'm ending my lecture where we began back in the 40s after World War II, and the start of the Cold War. And it may be that if Russia attacks the Ukraine, we may be in a situation very similar. We want a big fat circle. And we may be in the beginnings of another Cold War between the NATO nations and this expansionist Russia. And with that, I'm going to end the conversation. And I really look at my lecture, and I really look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much for your lecture. I hope everyone has enjoyed this. And now we will move on to the Q&A session. So students will come up and ask their questions. And we'll start from question one. Between your service in Afghanistan in 2012 to 2013 and in 2016 to 2017, did you notice any changes in the atmosphere in the nation that foreshadowed the events of 2021? For example, the political situation in Afghanistan changed? Did the population become less motivated?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. Look, I could spend hours talking about this, That's a subject, it's just a massive subject with everything that's happened in Afghanistan. Look, when I was there in 2012, 2013, we had 100,000 US troops in Afghanistan. We had 140,000 total with our NATO allies. We were in the lead. We were fighting the war against the Taliban, against the Al-Qaeda, against the internet, against the terrorist forces. I was one of the ambassadors at the time, and our job was, this was President Obama's, we were at the height of this surge. We were spending a huge amount of money. Maybe the war, military part, the diplomatic part, the intelligence and economic development was costing us something like $130 billion a year. It was an astronomical number. So when I got there, President Obama had given us instructions that he wanted to bring down our military presence and along with our NATO allies, and to Afghanize the conflict. So the Afghan military would be in the lead. Okay, we had been 12 years helping the Afghans get on their feet. We had provided a lot of economic assistance. We'd helped the creation of a new Afghan army. So that's what I did in 2012, 2013. Took the situation where we had this huge military presence and then gradually brought it down. By the end of 2014, we only had, again, from 140,000 US and NATO, we were down to 10% of that, to 15,000. So when I came back the second time, where I was the only ambassador left, because by then we used to have 5 ambassadors, but by the time I returned, I was the only ambassador. It was the end of the Obama administration and the first year of the Trump administration. We had 8,500 US troops and 8,500 NATO, so 15,000. By then, everything had changed. We were not in the lead. The Afghan army was doing 95% of the fighting and 99% of the dying. So my job in 2016, 2017 was to close the account for President Obama. You know, he had spent a lot of time on Afghanistan. I'm sure he got a lot of gray hairs because of Afghanistan, and help President Trump and his new national security team develop their approach on Afghanistan. And what I tried to do, and I don't want to go too long on this, is to create a sustainable model from a blood and treasure, so that we had a residual force of ground and air power, but it was small, but it was very effective. That's what we created. That with the Afghans in the lead, doing 95% of the fighting, 99% of the dying, but we were in the back providing support, training, advisory, some special forces. We had an air contingent, small but very effective, of 120 aircraft, continued to provide large-scale economic assistance to the Afghan people, to the government of Afghanistan. We were in common cause fighting the terrorist bad guys. I mean, the Taliban are not good guys. And I felt very good when I left at the end of 2017, the end of the first year of the Trump administration. I felt very good. I felt we had the model. We were spending 1/7 of the amount of money that we were spending at the height of our big military presence, and our blood was very small. We were from losing hundreds in killed and wounded. In my first tour, the total number of killed in action in 2017, the full year I was ambassador, was only 25. Now that's bad. Any soldier that you lose is bad, but it was a fraction of US Army training accidents. So we were in a situation that we were spending maybe 2% of US defense spending on Afghanistan, and our losses were very small. Yet we really hurt the Taliban through the very effective use of our air power, our small air power. We really hurt the Taliban. So when I left, we had seriously hurt Taliban's military power. They were on the defensive. Their morale was down, and I felt very good and very confident. But unfortunately, I left at the end of 2017. I had made a commitment to do what I did. I retired from government, but eventually we lost key people. President Trump fired National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster, who had served in Afghanistan as a military officer, Secretary of Defense Mattis, who had served in Afghanistan as a Marine general. And these people were very much in favor of maintaining an active presence along the lines of this small but sustainable model that we'd created. But after he fired these people, there were no more adults in the room. And President Trump, who had little experience, started managing things. And eventually he negotiated a very bad agreement with the Taliban, completely demoralized our allies in Kabul, in the government, in the armed forces who had fought bravely. And then lamentably, President Biden essentially agreed with President Trump. We precipitously pulled out our forces, and it led to the debacle that we've seen. The only point I would make is I spent a lot of my career and my energy in the Afghan fight. This didn't have to happen. This would be the one point I would make. What happened on August 15 with the collapse, with the fact that you have millions of people starving in Afghanistan, this should not have happened. It didn't have to happen. Okay?
Thank you very much.
Good morning, Ambassador. If Turkey becomes more aligned with Russia, would NATO make efforts to remove them from their alliance? Moreover, if Turkey was to be removed from NATO, how would this affect the economic relationship between Turkey and the United States?
Okay, what is your name again? Okay, can you introduce yourselves, please?
Oh, my name is Zidane.
Okay, Sedan, that's a great question. Yeah, what's happened is that, as I mentioned, Turkey has been a loyal member of NATO and a very strong security ally of the United States and since 1952. Through all the tough years of the Cold War, essentially what happened, though, is more recently, the government in Turkey, like in Russia, the leader of Turkey is a gentleman by the name of Erdogan, President Erdogan. And he has moved Turkey in the direction of authoritarianism. Erdogan, even though he was democratically elected, he has just, like Putin, has accumulated power, has cracked down on his opponents, limited press freedom. He carries a pretty fundamentalist Islamic approach. Turkey was actually an Islamic country, but it was ruled by a secular political class. So there was separation of church and state. He's moved in that direction. And Syria, the conflict in Syria, which has been very bloody, very complicated. I don't want to go there right now. But the end result was that within everything going on in Syria and the conflict, it resulted in a resurrection of relations between these two wannabe authoritarian leaders in Putin and Erdogan. So you've seen the establishment of closer relationship between Turkey and Russia. That is obviously of great concern to the US and the other NATO members. But the most significant thing was that Erdogan agreed to buy a large quantity of strategic ground-to-air missiles from Russia. And the point here is that we are in the US and NATO countries are in the process of reintroducing a new generation of fighter aircraft. It's the F-35. It's a very advanced, it's the most advanced fighter aircraft in the world. And Turkey is slated to get 100 of these F-35s. But because of the decision by Erdogan to buy these Russian missiles, the US suspended Turkey from acquiring this very sensitive US and NATO technology. So they're out of the program. And so there is that concern. Now, Erdogan has indicated that he doesn't want to buy Russian planes. He wants to buy, since he's out of the F-35 program, he wants to buy some other US planes, F-16s. And there are discussions. But the reality is for any agreement for the US to sell F-16s to Turkey would require the US Congress to approve. And I don't think that there is much appetite either in the Republican Party or the Democratic Party to give this, would-be kind of dictator in Erdogan more U.S. weapons, particularly since he's been flirting with the Russians. So I see a very difficult situation. I don't see any, I think that I do believe that Turkey will stay within NATO, okay? Because I think it's still ultimately in our strategic interest to keep them in line. The military is quite integrated with the NATO military. And Turkey has an interest in wanting to be part of NATO. But they're going to be sort of a little bit of the black sheep of the alliance. And cooperation is just not going to be as strong until either Erdogan changes his approach or ultimately there can be a new government elected in Turkey. You have a change in political leadership, and you can get a Turkish government that takes a more traditional approach and distances itself from Russia and gets back into the NATO camp. The one good news is that Erdogan has made some statements where he says he does not support a Russian attack against the Ukraine. So there's a possibility, and if you're a diplomat, that may provide an opportunity for the U.S. and the NATO allies to re-engage with Turkey.
Thank you.
Good morning, Ambassador. I'm Aithley. How will the reaction to the Ukrainian crisis? Good morning, Ambassador. I'm Ainsley. How will the reaction to the Ukrainian crisis by major non-NATO allies such as India impact other potential flashpoints worldwide, specifically relations in the Pacific with the People's Republic of China and North Korea?
Okay, Ashley, thank you very much. That's another really excellent question. Look, the world is very, very interconnected, and what happens in one place can have an impact in other places. So, no doubt, look, I would argue that the collapse of the U.S. position in Afghanistan, essentially the Taliban won and we lost. It was the Taliban is a fourth-rate military power, and they defeated us. That is the reality. We never lost a battle, a physical battle. But one point I would make is that war is not about who wins all the battles. War is really a test of wills. And it's like if you're in a wrestling match with someone and you're in the middle of this wrestling match and you really haven't been pinned down, but you decide to walk away. Well, you lost. You lost the match. So that's what happened in Afghanistan. The U.S. and NATO allies made a decision to precipitously withdraw, and the Taliban, our enemies, have taken over Afghanistan. I would say that that's already had an impact around the world, the geopolitical impact. I think that Putin has taken notice of the U.S.-NATO defeat, and it's emboldened him. So although the Ukraine has nothing to do with Afghanistan, nothing. Russia's designs on the Ukraine are a strategic dimension for Moscow that involves Europe. Still, psychologically, he's seeing, hey, I see weakness in Washington. I see weakness in Brussels, where the NATO leadership is. And when dictators sense weakness, they will push on the door. And that's a little bit of what we're seeing. That I would say that the coincidence of this, of how aggressive Putin has become in recent months, you maybe potentially could connect what happened in Afghanistan. So right there is an example, Aisley, to your question, that there is an impact. Now, the Ukraine will have an even bigger impact because this is in Europe. This is in the theater of operations of the NATO nations. So if somehow Putin was able to get his way in the Ukraine, whether he had a successful military operation that neutralized the Ukraine, and that the Ukraine was no longer a pro-Western democracy, that democracy was toppled, that a puppet government was installed. I'm not saying this is going to happen, but if it did, and a puppet government was installed that became pro-Russian, it would be a huge blow to the NATO nations. And that would potentially have, as you mentioned, consequences in other parts of the world. I would mention, certainly China, the other emerging superpower. And as you know, one of China's principal ambitions is to bring Taiwan back, reunify Taiwan as this this breakaway province from China. So, whether that, I'm not saying this would happen, but whether a very negative result for the U.S. and NATO in the Ukraine would embolden Xi Jinping, something where you have to be very concerned about. China also has been very aggressive, not only with regards to Taiwan, but with regards to their operations in the East China Sea with Japan. There are tensions between China and Japan. There are tensions in the South China Sea. Essentially, China has said that the whole South China Sea, which is shared with a number of other nations. If you look at the map, South China Sea, Vietnam, the Philippines, Malaysia, Indonesia, they all have water that is part of the South China Sea. Yet China has said that the South China Sea is Chinese, the whole of it. And there are tremendous strategic, political, military, resource, economic implications to this Chinese assertion that the South China Sea is theirs. So will what happens in the Ukraine further embolden the Chinese with regards to the South China Sea? It's an excellent question. Also, you have to look at Iran. We're at a very sensitive stage with Iran. Iran has been processing nuclear waste and building enough radioactive material, plutonium, that could allow them to create and deploy a nuclear weapon. There are diplomatic discussions going on between the Biden administration, some of the other interested parties, British, French, the Germans, including the Russians, to try to talk to the Iranians to try to restore some kind of agreement to ensure that Iran doesn't deploy a nuclear weapon. But will a negative result in the Ukraine, will it potentially embolden the mullahs in Tehran? You don't know. I don't know. But your question is excellent, because in the world we live in today, what happens in one place has the potential to have an impact in other places.
Thank you very much, Ambassador.
Good morning, Ambassador. My name is Tomas.
What is your name?
Tomas.
Okay.
The NATO-led peacekeeping force in Kosovo, the KFOR, have been deployed to the region since 1999, and the alliance is currently working on transferring responsibilities of NATO troops to local police forces. The Balkans, and Kosovo specifically, were the site of active ethnically and nationally fueled bloodshed only a couple of decades ago. For this reason, in your opinion, would you expect a withdrawal to negatively affect regional stability?
Again, Tomas, again, a really, really good question. I mentioned earlier in my presentation that in the post-Cold War period, one of NATO's major deployments was in the Balkans, in Kosovo, in Bosnia, after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the civil conflict resulting in genocide that occurred in Kosovo and in Bosnia. I would say that, the peacekeeping presence of NATO has helped maintain stability in the Balkans, in that part of the world. There's tremendous historic tensions between Serbia, which is a large power in the Balkans, and this new little republic of Kosovo. You have NATO forces there. The potential for renewed fighting between Serbians and the people of Kosovo and Bosnians, very Croats, very complicated kind of brew, kind of a witch's brew of historic antagonisms is very high. So, Tomas, if you ask me, I would be very reluctant to withdraw, precipitously withdraw NATO forces. I think we need to maintain a presence in Kosovo.
Good morning, Ambassador. My name is Ian. Due to the growing range of conflict that we see throughout the modern world, why does traditionally tend to only act in the face of physical conflicts, war, immigration, and famine? What about economic conflict or political conflict?
Listen, I didn't get your name, and I'm not getting good audio right now. Can you repeat everything?
Yeah, my name is Ian. Can you hear me a little better?
Ask it without the mic in. Can you hear me?
No, not very well. I'm sorry.
I'm trying to take off my mask. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, that's great. My name is Ian. My question is, due to the growing range of conflicts that we see throughout the modern world, why does NATO traditionally tend to only act in the face of physical conflicts such as war, immigration, and famine? What about economic conflict or political conflict?
Well, that's a great question, Ian. Another really superb question. Look, the NATO alliance is essentially a military alliance. So that's what it is. I mean, it is really where, you know, if a country has a trade war with another, well, that's a different order of tension, you know. The issue, NATO is strictly a military alliance. If there is a military attack on one of the members, then it's a defensive alliance, and the others would come collectively in the defense of the country that's been attacked. The reality, Ian, is that we have many mechanisms in the international system to deal with issues that relate to conflict, that are of an economic nature, of a financial nature, that are of an environmental nature. I mean, we just had COP26 in Scotland. If you're talking about dealing with the issue of climate change, and you're talking about what the impact of climate, is on, let's say, developing countries who face whatever, in heightened flooding, there are many mechanisms in the international system, through the UN, through the multilateral development banks, the World Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the World Food Program. You know, look at Afghanistan. You've had the collapse in Afghanistan. The economy has collapsed. People are starving in Afghanistan. I mean, it's a horrible, horrible situation. But right now, the UN system has deployed, with the support of the donor nations, the United States and European allies, to provide food assistance to feed the Afghan people. And the World Food Program would be the agency that would be on the ground in Afghanistan, getting the food to Afghans in cities, in the countryside. So the point is that NATO has a very narrow focus. And I think if you tried to get NATO to do too many things, you would dilute its effectiveness if it tried to do everything. Okay?
Thank you, Ambassador. Ambassador. My name is Emiliano Hernandez.
What is the name again? I'm sorry.
Emiliano Hernandez.
Can I speak loud? Hear me?
Emiliano Hernandez.
Emilio.
I was wondering if you could tell us about the hardest decision you have had to make during your career, and what was your rationale and mindset? And if you could please guide us through your decision-making process.
Wow. Well, look, again, I had a long career. I was very much a crisis manager. Who I usually, when I was sent as one of the ambassadors in Afghanistan in 2012, 2013, I wasn't sent there because I was an expert on Afghanistan. I was really sent more because I was someone who was seen in the State Department as effective in managing crises. And that was the reason why I came. Again, I was involved, I was the US ambassador, as I've been mentioned, in Honduras when we had a political coup in 2009. So I dealt with that crisis for 3 years. That was a tough situation because after the coup, all the other countries withdrew their ambassadors because we didn't recognize the de facto regime, the illegitimate government that took power after the military coup. And we did not recognize it. We knew it was a military coup and we opposed it. But Secretary Clinton asked me to stay. And she asked me to stay in Honduras because she was afraid that there would be a bloodbath. And the US ambassador plays a very important role in Honduras. So I was the only ambassador that stayed. I was I had no other colleagues, myself and my very able team, US Embassy team of Foreign Service officers. And we stayed and we were able to work on the side of democracy. We were able to ensure that there wasn't a civil conflict, a civil war in Afghanistan. We were able to work towards having free, fair elections. So eventually, we were able to restore the democratic and constitutional order. That was a very difficult period. You're working in a government that was a dictatorship that had taken over, an illegitimate government. They did not like what I was doing in Honduras or what my team was doing. So it was very tenuous from a security standpoint, from a political standpoint. But essentially, we were able to get the job done and get Honduras back on the democratic path. So that would be one. And then, of course, Afghanistan is always very difficult. I mean, I was leading the largest embassy, in the history of the world. We had a staff of 8,600 people in the U.S. Embassy in Kabul. We had 22 U.S. government agencies. It's a giant operation. So it's very demanding as a manager and a leader. It's just so big and so many programs. The budget was so big. And it made it very challenging that you're managing this diplomatic mission in the middle of a war. I mean, there was no safe place in Afghanistan. I mean, it's a conflict zone. We had some amazing people, great diplomats, expeditionary people who were willing to risk their lives every day to achieve our objectives, to make sure that Afghanistan was never used again as a base or a platform to attack our homeland. And we have some amazing diplomats. I led many great teams in my many years in the Foreign Service, but arguably my best teams were in Afghanistan. People, like I said, were risking their lives every day, high morale, really believed in what they were doing. But in Afghanistan, I would take a long time. There were just many decisions that I took there that really were of a life and death nature. And so, in a way, but for me, I ended my career as the ambassador, in Afghanistan. I retired out of Afghanistan at the end of 2017. And if you're a diplomat, for me, that was kind of the top of the food chain. If you're a crisis national security guy like me, it was great to have the honor to have done that. Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks, Emilio.
Morning, Ambassador. My name is Miguel. In the face of a warmer relationship between Russia and Turkey in recent years, what actions do you believe NATO can take in order to encourage Turkey, a key ally of the organization, to be in the favor of US and Europe rather than Russia?
Yeah, Miguel, that's another great question, but it's very similar to an earlier question. And again, again, Turkey has not been a very cooperative NATO ally in recent years under President Erdogan. But I'm happy to see that he has made recent statements. You might want to Google it, where he's been said that he would oppose any overt military action by Russia against the Ukraine. So there is a diplomatic opening there for us to make sure that get the Ukraine on side, to get Turkey on side on the Ukraine issue. So it's never game over in diplomacy. Okay, you are always working, and there's always a new opportunity. You never say never. So the Ukraine crisis, which is a very difficult, complicated situation, may provide an opportunity with regards to Turkey. Okay.
Thank you.
Look, I think I'm going to recommend one last question, and I'd like to say maybe have some final thoughts to close this out, because I am going to have to leave you guys in a few minutes because I have another obligation, okay? So maybe one more question, and then maybe we can sort of close it out. I'd like to say a few closing remarks as well.
Good morning, Mr. Good morning, Mr. Ambassador. My name is Juan Mendoza.
What is the name?
Juan Mendoza.
Juan, okay.
In response to me, I know you already talked a little about this, but I just wanted to know, what was it like working in such a hostile environment for a long period of time when you were dealing with the Honduran coup crisis? And did you ever feel like you were being threatened or endangered?
Yeah, Juan, that's a great question. Look, I think that, again, as I mentioned, it was very unusual serving as the only ambassador in Honduras. And our team, we were alone. Our embassy team was alone. We had no other diplomatic colleagues. We had a hostile government because it was a government that was backed by the Honduran military. So there were a lot of passions. The country was very divided. The previous government, which was a democratically elected government, led by Manuel Zelaya. Zelaya, although we opposed the overthrow of a legitimate democratically elected government, President Zelaya was a populist, and he had relations with Hugo Chavez and Fidel Castro. So he was playing with the left. Although he wasn't a dictatorship, but he had scared a lot of people and divided the country with his very inflammatory rhetoric. So he created a very negative context. Did not excuse the military going in and taking him out. But the end result is that after the coup, the situation in Honduras was very polarized. And it was like you have like a big barrel of gasoline. All you needed was to throw a match and the place would blow sky high. So yes, I mean, there was concern that we had. I am responsible as the ambassador for the security of all Americans, officials, but also all American citizens living in Honduras. So there was a great worry that if we lost control of the situation and it resulted in violence, that there was a potentially serious security threat against American officials and also American citizens, okay? All right, look, I am going to end it because I'm going to have to go. You guys are, first of all, again, Ivan, congratulations, job well done. I know you want to have, do you want to close some final, do you want to say something to end this, Ivan?
Yes, please.
Okay.
So just a few closing remarks. First of all, thank you, Ambassador. I'm sure that we have all learned a lot from your lecture, and your answers were very interesting in it. I doubt that we could have gotten this information from anywhere else. You definitely gave us a lot of knowledge that we wouldn't be able to find. In addition, I would like to thank the school and specifically Mr. Sanchalises, who is the head of our International Diplomacy Department and the sponsor of Gulliver's High School Foreign Service Association chapter. He did a lot to help us organize this and make this work, so thank you very much. And
Okay. All right, Ivan, again, wonderful job. And it's great that, you have such good relationship, student faculty in promoting international relations and diplomacy. So I think it's fantastic. Though, a couple final points. I want to reemphasize this idea that an international career is amazing. Like I said, I wouldn't change a minute of my professional career in the Foreign Service. But it's not just in government, in the State Department, but the world, as you know, is becoming closer and closer together. What happens in China or Africa or Latin America or Europe impacts on all of us. We're all part of this incredible family of human beings. And so think about it. Think about an international career. You could do it in many ways. You could have an international career and be an environmentalist. You could have an international career and be advocating human rights, be part of an international human rights NGO. You could be someone who wants to do multilateral diplomacy and join the United Nations and serve with other people from other countries as part of an international organization. You could be you might study economics or finance, and there are international financial institutions that play a critical role in our world, and also banking. I started out before I joined the Foreign Service, before I was able to pass the Foreign Service exam. I worked for a time in the international division of Chase Manhattan Bank. And if I wouldn't have joined the State Department, I would have worked with Chase and I would have served overseas because I wanted an international career. And Chase at that time had offices in 104 countries. So if I wouldn't have done a government career, I would have been in the private sector, traveling around with myself and then with my family, because it's something that kind of made me get up every morning, living internationally, the change, the travel, the different cultures, languages. So think about that. It's a great way of making a difference in the world, And then the other thing I would mention is this. I saw, your school has a very high Hispanic population, okay, by the names, okay? So I would just say that, I'm Hispanic as well. I was born in Cuba, came to the United States as a little kid back in 1961 at the very beginning of the Castro Revolution, was able to, thank God, my mom and dad was able to get my older sister, brother, and I out, and we were able to live in America in freedom and live the American dream. I mean, the U.S. has a lot of flaws. We've got a lot of problems in this country, but still America's, I think, still the greatest country in the world. And it's the greatest country in the world in giving young people an opportunity. In the America, even of today, you can do whatever you want. If you're really willing to sacrifice whatever area, whatever you want to do, you still can do it in America. I've traveled all over the world. I've lived in Europe, in South America, Central America, in Central Asia, the Middle East, in Southeast Asia, in Australia, in Canada. There are many great countries out there, but I think for opportunity, particularly for young people, there's no greater country than the U.S. So take advantage of it. You are really lucky to be where you are. But the other thing I would mention is we need more Hispanics in the Foreign Service. When I was ambassador in Honduras, I think I was the only Hispanic ambassador. And that's disgraceful. It's disgraceful that the Hispanic population is 15% of the U.S. population. The State Department was working very hard to bring in and recruit Hispanics into the Foreign Service, and we need more diversity. America's strength is its diversity. We have people that come from all over the world, all religions. That is a strength. We represent the world. I mean, America is the world that have been brought to this new world in this incredible experiment of people from all over. So we need more diplomats that are representative, and that represent all. We need more women in the Foreign Service. We need more Hispanics. We need more African Americans. We need more people of Middle Eastern descent, of South Asian descent. So, but I do, as a Hispanic, and I support diversity, period. But I do think that I encourage you to look at a career in the Foreign Service. We need very smart, all of you are extremely bright. You have a bright future, and we need some of your talent in the Foreign Service. So thanks. That's my pitch for the day.
Definitely ending on a call to action for all these students and their future. So thank you again, and we hope to speak with you again at some point in the future. Have a great rest of your morning.
Thank you so much. Thank you.